It's just a pleasure to welcome Mark Whitaker to Politics and Prose. He'll be discussing his new book, Cosby, His Life and Times. And I was thinking about this earlier today, thinking about the title of the book, and it just seems so simple. I thought, Cosby, His Life and Times. Okay, it sounds like a pretty straightforward biography. You just kind of review the guy's life and you talk about it. Then, of course, I considered the fact that Bill Cosby is probably the best known and best liked comedian of the past half century in this country. He's an American icon, cultural icon. He's an African American cultural icon, and he's a man whose career has also paralleled some of the country's most tumultuous years and controversial social and political movements. So as I sort of pondered all this, I then realized, well, actually writing the story of Bill Cosby's life and times maybe isn't such a simple proposition after all. Fortunately, the challenge of it did not deter Mark Whitaker, whose book is really fascinating. It's a very thorough examination of Bill Cosby's life. The reporting included time with Cosby himself, which I know Mark is going to discuss. And what comes through is that the Bill Cosby that many of us think of, the public Bill Cosby, is in reality a far more complex being, both temperamentally and in relation to the political and cultural times in which he became famous. An artistic genius, of course, also a man of contradictions and perhaps even paradoxes. Mark's career has made him very well suited to the task of writing about Cosby. He, of course, I think most of you know, he's a very highly regarded journalist and author. He was executive vice president and managing editor for CNN Worldwide, senior vice president and Washington bureau chief of NBC News, and the editor of Newsweek. And during the time that he was at the helm of Newsweek, the magazine won, I don't know, quite a few national magazine awards. So that's pretty impressive. He's also written a highly acclaimed memoir called My Long Trip Home. So we are especially glad here at Politics and Prose that he decided to put pen to paper again, and that for his second book he turned his attention to Bill Cosby. It's a really fascinating story that he tells. I want to congratulate him on a job really well done. I hope you all will read it, recommend it to your friends. Bill Cosby's a really important figure whose life really mirrors a lot of what the other questions that we all have about our own evolution as a country over these last many decades. So please join me in welcoming Mark Whitaker to Politics and Prose.
Thanks, Lisa. So this week is the 30th anniversary of the debut of The Cosby Show, which is probably the thing that Bill Cosby is most remembered for. And actually today is the anniversary. So the pilot episode of The Cosby Show aired on September 20th, 1984. So I thought it would be appropriate. I wanted to start just by reading a little passage from the book to read the story of the dinner in Los Angeles at Cosby's home in Pacific Palisades, where the sort of concept for The Cosby Show came together. And it was a meeting between Cosby and two young producers, television producers, named Marcy Carsey and Tom Werner, who had been at ABC and gone out on their own to start their own production company. And they specialized in sitcoms. And their first project was a sitcom with Madeline Kahn, if any of you remember her from the Mel Brooks movies. Anyway, it hadn't worked. It was canceled after one season. And they had mortgaged their homes, they were in debt, and basically they had one more trip to the plate, and they decided to try to bet their company on a new sitcom with Bill Cosby. And they arranged to meet him with his two agents from the William Morris Agency, who are named Norman Brokaw and Larry Auerbach. So they all show up at Cosby's house for dinner, and this is what happens. When they arrived, Cosby greeted them at the door, a big cigar in hand as usual. He apologized that Mrs. Cosby couldn't join them and explained that she was at home in Massachusetts with their children. Still, Carsey could feel Camille's presence in the house. Among the many works of art on the walls was one that struck Carsey in particular, a portrait of the Cosbys sitting under a tree. Camille was posed elegantly on her knees, her back straight, her eyes fixed forward with a regal air. Her husband was sprawled casually on his side, a mischievous expression on his face. Carsey gazed at the portrait and reflected on what it said about the couple's relationship, the obvious reverence that Cosby had for his wife, but also the interesting commentary on how their personalities complemented one another. Cosby ushered his 4 guests, Carsey, Werner, Auerbach, and Brokaw, to the dinner table, and they didn't get up until past midnight. At first, Cosby said that if he was going to return to television, he wanted to do an hour-long drama. He threw out the concept of a high-rolling New York City private eye who ate at the 21 Club. Politely but firmly, Carsey and Werner made the case for a half-hour comedy. That's what we know how to do, Werner said. If you really want to do a drama, we're not the right people. Carsey started to make the argument for a show about family, based on the strong point of view reflected in Cosby's comedy routines. It would be about the loving, quote, war between parents and their children, in which the authority of the mother and father was constantly tested, but never broken. Flattered by the respect the producers showed for his stand-up material, Cosby warmed to the idea. Yet when it came to the profession that Cosby's character would have on the show, he and the 2 producers had 2 very different ideas. Cosby thought it would be funny for the character to drive a limousine. He pointed out that it would allow him to tell stories about all the people and situations he encountered on the job and give him a flexible schedule so that he could be at home during the day to interact with his children. Cosby also liked the idea of a contemporary 2-career marriage and proposed that the wife be a plumber or a carpenter. A woman who was handier around the house than her husband. That would be a clever role reversal, he thought. And she would be Latina and speak Spanish, so that when they had an argument, her husband wouldn't be able to understand what she was saying. Cosby was talking with such forcefulness, pointing his cigar, and using a "this is how it should be" tone of voice, that for a while all Carsey and Werner could do was sit back and listen. Carsey heard 2 voices inside her head. One was saying, "Do whatever he wants. He's Bill Cosby, for God's sakes. You need him, and you need this show." But another was saying, "He's Bill Cosby. Even if he throws you out of this house, you need to tell him what you really think. You owe that to yourself and to him." Finally, Cosby finished talking, and the producers sketched out their vision. They imagined a working couple too, but they felt strongly that both should be college graduates. As Cosby had proven in his stand-up act, the war of wits between parents and children was even funnier if the parents thought of themselves as highly intelligent people. Making the character a limo driver would bring economic issues into the show, which would be a distraction from the dominant theme of family. Laying on more respectful flattery, Carsey and Werner told Cosby that they envisioned a simple show with minimal plots that would do what he did best, find the universal humor in everyday situations. For several hours, the conversation went back and forth, with Cosby continuing to muse about the limo driver and the handywoman, and Carsey and Werner arguing with increasing firmness for their concept. "Hey, chauffeurs make good money," Cosby insisted. "The guy will own his own car, meaning he'll be free to be at home at all kinds of weird hours, especially when his wife is working." Finally, before 1 o'clock in the morning, Cosby said the words that made Marcy Carsey think she might be getting someplace. "I think my wife would agree with you," Cosby said. As it turned out, he was right. "You will not be a chauffeur," Camille said when he briefed her on the meeting. "Why not?" Cosby asked. "Because I'm not going to be a carpenter," Camille said. "What's the problem?" he said. "Is there something wrong with being a chauffeur or carpenter?" "Bill, of course, there's nothing wrong with those occupations. I'd be stupid if I thought that," she said. "But nobody's going to believe that you're a chauffeur. Your image has always been Temple University, college, grad school. Nobody's going to believe it when you put on a uniform and stand beside a car and start polishing it. And people are going to laugh in your face when they see me with a hammer." Camille rarely got so adamant about casual things. so Cosby could tell that she was taking the decision about his next TV role very seriously. It was as if she was saying that he hadn't come this far, fighting for the dignity of the Alexander Scott and Chet Kincaid characters on his previous shows, creating the role model of Fat Albert for kids, earning a doctorate in education, to fall back on the stereotypes conjured up by a black chauffeur and a Latina handywoman. More quickly than her husband, she also understood that once he had brought her and their children into his comedy routines, viewers would assume that the show was based, at least in part, on their real life. As usual, Cosby trusted Camille's judgment, but he also didn't want to live with her displeasure. At one point, she told him that the limo driver idea was so crazy he should see a psychiatrist and bring back a note. He knew he wasn't going to win the argument, so he got back to Brokaw and told him to inform Carsey and Werner that he would drop the chauffeur idea and agree to the more upscale professions. It was quickly decided that his character would be an obstetrician, a job that Cosby suggested because it reminded him of the medical counseling he had done as a physical therapist in the Navy, and that his wife would be a lawyer. And that's how Cliff and Claire Huxtable came to be. So let me just talk. I want to leave as much time as possible just to answer your questions, but let me talk a little bit about why I was interested in Bill Cosby. As Lisa said, I've been a journalist most of my career, first at Newsweek and then at NBC and CNN, covering politics and wars and a whole variety of subjects. But on a personal level, Bill Cosby has always been someone who's been meaningful in my life. I was 9 years old when I first encountered Bill Cosby. My mother bought one of his early comedy albums called Wonderfulness. My parents, I come from an interracial family. My father was black, my mother is white. And they had divorced 3 years earlier. We were living in Los Angeles, and my mother took my younger brother and me back to the East Coast to live. And my father sort of dropped out of our lives. So here I was, 9 years old, in this little college town where we settled. My mother was a teacher there, where there were no people of color. And one day she brings home this comedy album with this handsome young black man, just about my father's age on the cover, riding a go-kart, beaming, telling these hilarious stories about having his tonsils out, smearing the floor with Jell-O to keep the chicken heart monster away. And like everybody who heard those early comedy albums, I thought they were hilarious. But I think that when I look back, first of all, they were bringing much needed laughter and humor into my life at a sad time. And also, I think on some level, giving me, another black male to identify with. And then I found out that that Cosby was on I Spy. And despite the fact that it was past my bedtime and my mother hated all of those, kind of James Bond spy type TV shows, she made an exception and let me stay up to watch I Spy. And I discovered this very different Bill Cosby, who was this cool, laid back, sort of hip character. And then 20 years later, in the 80s, just as the Cosby Show was coming on the air, I was about to get married to my wife, who's here, and we were about to start a family. So in addition to loving that show and thinking it was very funny, it was sort of a model for the kind of family we hope to have. And in working on this book, I've found many, many people who felt the same way about that show. So I had a personal interest, but I also, as a journalist, was very intrigued by him, and particularly over the last 10 years, in the way that after an entire career where he and often he got a lot of criticism for this, kept racial commentary and even any political commentary, for the most part, out of his work, out of his comedy, out of his TV shows. He has emerged and is probably best known in the last 10 years for taking some very, very strong stances on behavior in the black community. And, there's been a lot of debate. He's very controversial among African Americans because of that. And it just kind of made it clear that he is a far more complicated character than I think the sort of, some of the persona that he's had, Cliff Huxtable in the crazy sweaters and so forth would necessarily lead you to believe. I also thought that his story was also the story of all the changes that have taken place in race relations in this country over the last 50 or 60 years, the changes that have taken place in the world of entertainment. I mean, you think about, he became famous for comedy albums, and, we don't have comedy albums anymore. He was, it was really the sort of the way in which television became the dominant medium in this country that made him a big star. So I also sort of wanted to use that backdrop in telling his story, and it's a reason that the book is called Cosby: His Life and Times. It's very much his life story and more of his life story than has ever been told before, but it's also the story of the times that informed him and that he in turn shaped. Anyway, so and after I'd finished my first book, I proposed this idea to my literary agent and to my editor, and they loved the idea. And I'd done enough research to know that there'd never been a really serious book about Bill Cosby. And then I discovered why. Because when I first approached him, not directly, but through somebody we knew in common, Alvin Poussant, a Harvard psychiatrist who was the advisor on the Cosby Show, who was somebody I knew, and he agreed to approach Cosby on my behalf and called back a week later to say, I don't think he's going to help you. Then his lawyer called me to tell me that if I proceeded with this book, I wasn't going to get any help from him. But I decided to go ahead anyway, and again, I wasn't sure what exactly the book would be at that point. But I thought there was enough there, and he was an interesting enough subject that it was worth going ahead. And I spent the next year sort of reporting around the edges. I mean, going back to the episodes in his life that I could reconstruct, from other sources and from things that had been written at the time, the I Spy years, for example. And, there were, because of, my previous work in journalism, I was able to talk to a fair number of people, but there are other people who wouldn't talk to me without his permission. But I also kept in touch with his publicist, David Brokaw, Norman Brokaw's son, out on the West Coast. And about a year into my reporting, I started getting emails from David Brokaw, the publicist, saying, he calls it Cosby Mr. C. Mr. C wants you to be aware of this or that thing that's been written about him. And because I had been working on it all this time, I actually had read all those things. So I would email back, say, yes, I've read that. So I don't know whether they were testing me or, but I think they saw that I was doing my homework. Then, a few months after that, I got another call from the lawyer, and he said, much friendlier tone this time, he said, Mr. Cosby wants to speak with you. And I said, is it good? Is it bad? He said, I'm not going to speak for him. He's on the road. He's going to call you. But at some point, you're going to be getting a call. And sure enough, about a month and a half after that, I was just leaving a job at CNN at the time, and the day I announced that I was leaving, my assistant runs into my then assistant runs into my office and says, Bill Cosby's on the phone. And I pick up the phone, and the unmistakable voice says, congratulations. And I said, Mr. Cosby, how are you? What are you congratulating me for? He said, Mark, he said, as though now we were good friends. He said, when I write my comedy routines, I have a process I call loading the boat. And I'm going to help you load your boat. And so from then on, it became a very different project because I had access to him. It wasn't, unbridled access. I traveled with him at one point and had a lot of time with him during a weekend on the road, which is the way the book opens. And we had about a half dozen very long phone interviews. Again, never scheduled. He would call me. Also, he doesn't really answer questions. He tells stories. So, and he always called with something he wanted to tell me. But I knew once he was on the phone, he would start telling stories. So my job was to be ready with the questions that would elicit the stories that I needed to fill the holes that I needed in the book, that were still there in the book. But just as valuable and probably more were the fact that there were people who wouldn't talk to me without his permission, and also a lot of people who he made me aware of who not only did I not know about, but nobody knew about. I mean, from early on in his life. People he grew up with in North Philadelphia, first in Germantown, and then in the Robert Allen Homes housing project, and his commander in the Navy, the Navy buddy who introduced him to his wife. And many of the stories in this book, particularly in the first part of the book before he becomes famous, really come from them, from the people who knew, the Bill Cosby before he became Bill Cosby. And I'll just say one more thing, and then I'll just take questions. But when I was the weekend I spent traveling with him, he said something. I wanted to use all the time I had with him, traveling on planes and in airport lounges and backstage, mostly talking about his early years before he became famous. But I also wanted to talk to him about comedy, and how he thought about comedy. And he said to me, as we were talking about that, he said, for me, getting a laugh is secondary. It's not the most important thing when I perform. And I said, oh, that's interesting, from one of the funniest people on the planet. And he said, my first objective, he said, is to put you there. And what he meant by that was to tell stories that are so engrossing that you will just follow him, and then along the way, he'll figure out a way to make them funny, so you'll keep laughing. And I thought about that a lot. And particularly once, I was able to, with all the reporting I had already done, and then with the ability to talk to him and all these people who knew him, that was what I was going to try to do in this book. I wasn't going to write a book where I told you what to think about Bill Cosby, or I even evaluated, what he had done in retrospect. I was going to write a book that kind of put you there and made you see and be in the room as things were developing. Before the Cosby Show became a big hit, before his comedy albums took off, what was it like, just as those things were coming together? Anyway, it was a fascinating and very fun project to work on, and I hope everybody who reads it has as much fun reading it as I had writing it. So I'd love to. I know I've been, both from my reporting on this book and since I've been out, since the book has been published, people have lots of questions about Bill Cosby in different phases of his career and life. So please let me know what you'd like to know.
I would like to know, I read the book, but what really surprised you the most about Bill Cosby? What was there in the man that you just had no idea was there?
Well, there are little details about some of the things. For example, I guess people now will know more about it because there's going to be an exhibit for the first time. But he and his wife Camille have, over the years, amassed what is the most valuable and most historically important private collection of African American art in the world. And I tell the story of sort of how that started, and they've never loaned it out to a museum. And for the first time, there's going to be an exhibit of the Cosby collection at the Smithsonian. They just announced it this week in November. So, and it's going to be here in Washington. So that's going to be a big event. Another little funny little thing is when Cosby was in the Navy. I talk in the passage about how he was a physical therapist in the Navy, and you know, he joined the Navy. You know, he grew up in North Philadelphia, poor. He was a very bright kid. He was tested in 5th grade, had the highest IQ in his grade, but he was a terrible student. You know, just couldn't focus on his studies, wanted to be the class clown, and so forth. So he gets into Central High School, which was sort of the big public magnet school in Philadelphia, but he flunks 10th grade twice, then transfers to another high school, drops out of high school, and just before his 19th birthday, he joins the Navy. And the Navy is the two sort of before he becomes a big star, the two experiences that really turned his life around and, you know, I think put him on another course besides just spending the rest of his life on a street corner in North Philadelphia. One was joining the Navy, where he really started to develop habits of discipline and, you know, and so forth they never had before. And then he decided while he was in the Navy that he was going to try to go to college, despite the fact that he hadn't finished high school. He gets a GED, and then he uses his charm and his athletic ability essentially to get a track scholarship to Temple. Talks the track coach into you know, getting him in, and at the age of 23. Anyway, his commander for his last year in the Navy was a female physical therapist. He was assigned to a physical therapy ward at the Philadelphia Naval Hospital. And his commander is a woman named Lieutenant Jean Lamb. And she was a dog lover, and she had this frisky little miniature schnauzer she would bring to the hospital ward. And Cosby and the dog were like this comedy routine on the therapy ward. They would, you know, at 4 o'clock every afternoon, Cosby would sit down and tell stories about Chipper the dog and how he was teaching Chipper how to talk, and all of a sudden, sort of, all the patients, nobody was missing an appointment, and it became this sort of fun place to hang out in the hospital ward. Anyway, so Cosby leaves the Navy. Lieutenant Lamb stays on, eventually becomes a captain, and a decade later, she is about to retire from the Navy, and she's in Las Vegas for a convention of physical therapists. And Cosby, at this point, is a big star playing Las Vegas, and they've hired him to be the headliner at this convention. And so they have this big reunion, and Cosby says, well, what are you going to do with yourself now that you're going to retire? And she says, well, you know, remember Chipper the dog? I want to start breeding and training show dogs. And Cosby says, great, I'll help you. So over the next 35 years, the team of her married name, what now is Jean Heath, as breeder and trainer, and Cosby as investor and financial backer, produced the string of prize-winning miniature schnauzers and Lakeland Terriers, including several that, you know, were prize winners at the Westminster Dog Show. So in addition to everything else, Bill Cosby, dog lover and, you know, show dog impresario. So there are a lot of little things like that most people don't know. But, you know, the other thing that really, to me, was fascinating about studying Bill Cosby and then even interviewing him was, you know, I mentioned that my parents were college professors. I became a journalist. I've spent my whole life around people who measure brilliance in terms of the ability to think and express yourself in a linear way, in a sort of analytical way. And Cosby is the complete opposite. He's brilliant, but he thinks and expresses himself not at all in a linear way. It's all associative, creative, intuitive, emotional. He's a storyteller. And I became fascinated not just in his life, but sort of how his mind works. And I tell these stories about, it's been true throughout his career, but the Cosby Show, a lot of the great episodes that people remember, you know, the lip sync, when they lip sync to Ray Charles, or the episode with where the different generations danced, or the one with the orange juicer that Rudy and her little friend, you know, got into and ended up making a big mess in the kitchen. Those all started with these ideas that Cosby would come into, and they weren't like fully developed story ideas. It was just like, you know, it would be fun if the Huxtables lip sync. What can we do with that? And the writers would roll their eyes and say, well, you know, how are we going to turn that into half-hour television? But then they develop it, and it would, you know, turn into something like really special. And Cosby has this expression about finding the funny. You know, you tell a story and you find the funny. And he just had this genius for just these germs of ideas that once you started to, you know, work with them would allow the cast to find the funny. And in interviewing him, that's exactly what I found, which is, you know, I mean, I've done a lot of interviewing, but he was unlike any interview I had. First of all, I could never schedule an interview. He would call me, usually late at night, and he would have something that he wanted to tell me about. So often it was like a very minor point or something that was on his mind. But I knew that once he called, there's rarely a short conversation with Bill Cosby, and he loves to tell stories. And so my job was to be ready with the questions that would lead to the stories that that I felt like I needed for the book. So you know, I mean, to discover the mind behind all of this was interesting. Was really fascinating, and not something I completely expected.
Not to turn the subject into too serious, but did you have opportunities to talk with him about some of his more controversial political views of recent years?
I did. The only, you know, he never explicitly laid down any ground rules. And again, by the time he called me, he was sort of coming to me, you know. But his representatives made it clear he was not going to talk about his personal life. So everything that's in the book about his personal life, I had to get from other sources. And the stuff where I could get it and I was absolutely sure that it had happened, I put it in the book. And there were other things that, you know, I just was not in a position to report independently, and I did not put in the book as a result. But about his stances, you know, it was not. We didn't have, and again, he's not. You know, he's not even deeply analytical about those positions. And I tell the story in the book. You know, it all started when he really sort of got attention for this sort of critique of, you know, of some of the stuff that's going on, you know, in black communities. It was 10 years ago, in 2004, at the 50th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court decision. There was an event here in Washington to commemorate it. And, you know, everybody was anybody in the world of black politics and so forth, civil rights, and, you know, the civil rights, you know, establishment was at this event. And there were many speakers, and Cosby was supposed to come up at the end and just receive an award for his philanthropy, all the money that he and his wife have given to historically black colleges and universities, say a few funny things and get off the stage. But during the course of the evening, he became so enraged hearing one speaker after another come up and talk about all the progress that had been made, when he basically felt like, yeah, we've made progress, but we haven't made enough progress. And so when it came his time to speak, he got up and he just went off in a way that I don't think he had planned. It was very emotional tirade, really. And some of it was funny. I mean, and at the time, people were laughing, but they were laughing nervously. And, you know, he was conjuring up all these images, and, you know, it's now known as the pound cake speak, and one of them was, you know, somebody who gets shot in the head, you know, for stealing pound cake, but why did you steal the pound cake, you know? Your parents should have told you better. Anyway, it then, you know, elicited all of this controversy. So when I talked to him about that, again, it was more in terms of, it wasn't a sort of intellectual discussion about the critique, it was in terms of stories, you know, of what it was like for him growing up. And despite the fact that his mother was a domestic who worked 12-hour days, raising 3 children largely on her own because his father was a drunk who had run away, who had left the family to join the Navy because he didn't want to be, you know, couldn't deal with the responsibilities of being a parent and so forth. But if she wasn't looking after them constantly, she had other mothers in the projects who were keeping an eye on the kids, you know, and he had grandparents who were constantly on him about, you know, even though he was a bad student, about his grades and so forth, and trying to keep him on the straight and narrow. So what I discovered, and when you know, Cosby started saying these things, he was attacked by some people who basically called him an elitist, saying this is this rich, you know, black celebrity who's completely out of touch with the conditions in the inner city. The fact is, the opposite is true. Cosby was talking with such fervor because that was his life story. He sees himself in those kids because they're the modern version of the kid that he was growing up in North Philadelphia. And he thinks that the reason that he got off the streets of North Philadelphia and eventually got into a position to be as successful as he was because his mother was looking out after him, his grandparents were looking out after him, you know, his commanders in the Navy were on him, and then eventually, because he, despite the fact that, you know, he had been sort of a screw-up in high school, he managed to get into Temple and to get an education, and eventually, you know, he even got a master's and doctorate in education. So, yeah, I mean, it can come off in a very emotional way, and sometimes, you know, you can argue with the way he expresses his ideas, but it very much comes from seeing himself in their story. And then the other thing that I would say is that, and he's in some of the things we talked about, but also just in sort of analyzing other things he said about it, there's also this idea among his critics that in this critique he completely ignores institutional racism, and so he's essentially blaming the victim. And that's not fair or true either. I mean, the fact is he's very aware of institutional racism. He has, throughout his career, despite the fact that he wasn't talking about racial issues in his comedy, going back to the 60s when he first became a star, he was a big supporter of civil rights movements and privately quite outspoken about, you know, the evils of racism and some of the injustices of, you know, the legal system and the political system and so forth. But basically his view is if black folks just expect their circumstances to change when the system changes, they can wait a long time. Or they can do, while they're waiting and still challenging the system, they can also do things that are in their own power. And what's in their own power? It's, you know, what they do in their own home. It's how they raise their kids. It's, you know, the value they place in education. It's, you know, telling, you know, their kids that, you know, no matter how they behave with their friends, that, you know, they need to be able to speak English a certain way and dress a certain way if they're going to get a job. You know, so the two things are not mutually exclusive.
I'm a huge Cosby Show fan, and I had a question about Cosby's approach with the Cosby Show.
Yeah.
And so, for much of the season, well, much of the 8 seasons, there's this, what you talk about, few discussion about racial, social issues, but I think the last episode happened during, I think, the Rodney King 92 riots, and so I think the show didn't mention it, and I was very curious to know what was Cosby's view about a lot of what was going on in America during that time period.
Well, there are a couple of reasons. First of all, I mean, you know, I show, I think, in the book that there was, you know, the Huxtables were, again, described by some people as sort of being, I mean, I think the critic John Leonard in New York Magazine called them Leave It to Beaver and Blackface, you know, that they were sort of not an authentically black family. But that, in fact, they drew very much, even though it hadn't been Cosby's life experience, on a sort of, you know, a type of, you know, middle class, upper middle class black family that actually, I think, really sort of for him harked back even to the days of segregation. And it was very much, you know, the family that his wife, Camille Hanks, then Cosby, grew up in not far from here in Silver Springs, Maryland, was very much like that. The household that Felicia Rashad, who played his wife, was like that. You know, these households that, you know, where the parents were professionals, and there was a, you know, high value placed on education and on culture and so forth. And if you look at that show, even though there aren't a lot of overtly racial plot lines, jazz is in the background, black art is in the background, the you know, historically black colleges and universities. So, you know, not only does Denise go to Hillman, but Cosby gets a show made, a completely new show made called A Different World, you know, about life at a historically black, I mean, who else but Bill Cosby, first of all, would have had that idea and could have made it happen? Now, as far as the Cosby Show was concerned, he also wanted that show to sort of, he had in his mind that he wanted to be a classic like I Love Lucy or The Honeymooners, you know, these great, that would live on forever, you know, in syndication and so forth. And that it would sort of have a longer shelf life if it wasn't topical. So it wasn't just about avoiding race or politics. It was just not really sort of talking about issues that would make the show seem dated. But interestingly, once he, you know, pushed to get A Different World made, he had a meeting with Debbie Allen, who was the showrunner, Felicia's sister, who was a showrunner for Different World, and a young black female writer named Susan Fales, who had been a writer on The Cosby Show, and he asked to go work on A Different World. And so he has this meeting with Debbie Allen, and she says, look, you know, if we're going to do a show about life on a black campus, I want to deal with the kind of issues that they deal with, you know, and there's issues of bigotry and issues of, you know, sexually transmitted diseases and, you know, you name it, right? And he said, fine. And Susan Fales, who was, you know, I interviewed, who was at the meeting, sort of thought, well, wait a second, you know, she keeps lecturing the writers on The Cosby Show about how we got to keep politics out of it. And she realized, well, that's just The Cosby Show. And when it comes to A Different World, he's perfectly willing, you know, to be topical. The other thing, which is kind of poignant, is the one political story at the time that actually is reflected quite strongly in The Cosby Show is the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. The very first episode, there's this iconic scene where Cliff goes to talk to Theo about his, you know, miserable, all the D's on his report card, and it's in Theo's messy room. And if you go back and you notice, there's a little sign that says abolish apartheid on the back of Theo's door, which stayed there. The second season, they're shooting the first episode of the second season, and by then the show is this huge hit and, you know, commanding all these advertising money and so forth. And the word comes down just as they're about to start taping that NBC wants the sign taken down from the door. This is 1985 because a lot of the big advertisers still had investments in South Africa. Cosby calls his producers in and says, if that sign comes down, I'm walking off the set. There will be no show. Later, when Sandra, the oldest daughter, has children, she has twins, and Cosby suggests that they be named Nelson and Winnie. Miriam Makeba was a guest on the show later on. So at least in that area, he was willing, in a subtle way, but a very clear way, to sort of show where the Huxtables stood on that issue. So Nelson Mandela is released from prison in 1990. In 1995, he becomes the president of South Africa. In 1997, Cosby's son Ennis is murdered in this tragic thing. He was studying for his doctorate in education at Columbia. He goes on vacation to L.A. to visit a friend. He's driving the vehicle that the Cosbys keep out there for their own use, this very expensive Mercedes convertible, gets a flat tire in the middle of the night on the San Diego freeway, pulls over to an access drive, and as he's changing the tire, this 19-year-old Ukrainian thug, probably hoping to rob him or ends up killing him. And it was just devastating for the Cosbys. And not only did they have to deal with the grief of losing Ennis and burying him and so forth, but then they were worried about their own safety. People didn't know whether people were going to come after Cosby. They couldn't go back to their home in New York because there were just reporters everywhere. And it was a very incredibly stressful couple of months after the murder. And so in March of that year, so Ennis is killed in January. Cosby decides that he, and particularly his wife, she was in trauma over losing Ennis, but also just, they hadn't caught the killer yet, and it was just, she was going sort of crazy about it. And Cosby just decided he needed to get her out of the country. So he reached out to Randall Robinson of Trans-Africa, who was friendly with him, and arranged for a visit to South Africa. And while they're in South Africa, Nelson Mandela first invites them to the presidential palace and is incredibly kind to them about Ennis and so forth, and then takes them on to Robben Island, where he had been in prison. And as they are touring Robben Island and visit the jail cell where he spent most of his years as a political prisoner, Mandela tells Cosby the story of how during the Cosby Show years, it was watching the show every week with his white guards that allowed them to actually get to know each other. And that also the political prisoners from the ANC on Robben Island, who for the most part were actually very well educated, took it upon themselves, whether they were there, to teach the illiterate criminal prisoners, black criminal prisoners. And one of the ways they did that was after watching the Cosby Show, which was shown in South Africa every week, they would, as they were doing hard labor and breaking limestone rock, they would trace out the words that they had heard on the show to teach the criminal prisoners, how to read. So it's sort of a, it came full circle in a sort of a poignant way. Somebody, yes, ma'am. Yep.
You sort of answered this in a way, but and several times you've mentioned his giving to black colleges, and specifically Spelman. I know
yes,
got the largest ever grant.
Which, by the way, at the time, give you an idea, both of the scope of the donation, but also the financially strapped conditions of those institutions. At the time, that was almost half of the existing endowment of schools.
Yes. I know Janetta Cole was overwhelmed and has become a good friend. But that and then South Africa, what are the other passions into which he and Camille pour what must be huge resources?
Well, you know, I mentioned art. In addition to education, by the way, the other thing, so, you know, I think the big institutional giving, he's basically supported it, but I think that's really been her passion. Cosby has been very generous, but often in a very anonymous and very individual way. So there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of young African Americans who he's personally put through college. You know, he'll just meet them or hear about somebody, and he has several groups of people who kind of look out for people who who are gifted, but might need his help. And he just quietly, without any fanfare, puts them through school. You know, jazz music has been. I mean, jazz is a big theme in the book, so I talk about. And you know, if he really wanted to be a jazz drummer, and if he had been better at it, he probably never would have become a comedian. But jazz has a huge influence on his style of comedy. And he continues to be a huge jazz fan, and you know, as the MC at the Playboy Jazz Festival in Los Angeles and so forth. But also, one of the things he's done over the years is, in addition to giving his time free to all these jazz events, he's helped support a lot of these jazz musicians who never saved any money, and to pay for their hospital bills and their funerals and so forth. So that's another big passion. And as far as Mrs. Cosby, you know, in the years when she was raising her children, she kept a very low profile. But once they were grown, you know, she became a producer. She put the story of the Delancey sisters, you know, the two African American sisters who lived to be 100 and so forth. She brought it to the stage. She's been engaged in a big oral history project, interviewing, you know, leading figures in the world of politics and culture and so forth. So there'll be a sort of permanent oral history archive. And she herself actually, you know, first he got a doctorate in education from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and then she did as well. So, you know, you know, they just celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary, and they've been through a lot of tragedy. You know, he wasn't always faithful. That's, you know, documented in the book. And I did not speak to her. She's incredibly private, so I tried to. I put in a request, but I was politely told that I would not get to talk to her. But she's still a huge figure in the book, and I asked Alvin Poussant, who knows them very well, you know, what's kept them together all these years, and he said, well, you know, first of all, they adore each other. I mean, for all the things that they've been through, but then they have all these things in common. You know, these you know, the passion for education, for art, and for history. You know, and I tell the story at the end of the book about how they celebrated. He had a surprise for her on the 50th anniversary of their wedding, which is kind of a fun story at the end of the book. Any other questions?
I think I just want to point out, if you haven't picked up the book, we do have them up front. Mark will sign at the end, and I just thought maybe I could end with one last question, if nobody else has one. And I sort of a two-part question, so I'll try to make it short. But you started off by saying that you sort of viewed Cosby almost as a father figure. There's a very emotional, sort of personal connection or gravitation toward him. And then obviously, though, doing this project, you've done it journalistically.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering if there was any sort of tension as you were doing the book on sort of the personal pull to him and having to possibly, you know, have a much more realistic view.
Yeah, well, no, that's a very good question. I mean, I guess I would say that I didn't, you know, I felt that it was my obligation as a journalist to try to be, you know, objective about him. But I also, you know, and I've met in the course of working on this book, you know, hundreds and hundreds of people who, again, have a sort of emotional connection to him. So it wasn't so much that I felt like again, I try to be dispassionate in telling the story, but at the same time, I try to capture the very real way in which he connects with people, which is something I understand because I felt that time at different points in my life. But I think it is a gift that he has. And to this day, when you go and you watch him perform, 77 years old, sitting there alone in a chair, no props, nothing, telling these stories. And it's not just that he makes people laugh, but somehow he has this emotional bond with his audience that is quite rare. So I think it was having experienced that at times in my life that I think made me interested in that, and I hope able to convey that part of his appeal in writing about it.
And do you know if he's read the book, or is he still talking to you?
Yeah, well, you know, I, again, because of the way it all had sort of happened, I was under no obligation to send him the book, but I thought I should, you know, given that ultimately he was helpful and his people were helpful. I didn't send it directly to him. I sent it to Brokaw, who, you know, had been sort of the intermediary, and to Dr. Poussin, and to the lawyer. And I heard back sort of on behalf of all of them from Brokaw. There were things that they weren't happy about seeing in the book, but I think they knew that everything that I reported, you know, I was on very solid ground. So they didn't dispute it, and they didn't ask me to change anything. I have heard from him a couple of times, but it's never about a verdict on the entire book. So I'll tell you one story which sort of tells you something about Bill Cosby, and at least makes me know that he has read the book, even if, you know, he hasn't directly told me what he thinks of it. Again, out of the blue one night, I get a call, and it's Bill Cosby, and he says, pick up the phone, he says, "Frank Silvera." And I said, "Yeah." And I said, "He's in the book." He said, "I know, but he deserves more credit." Now, what he was talking about was when he was cast in I Spy by Sheldon Leonard, the producer, he had no acting experience. He was just starting to take off as a comic, but he had never acted. And he, at the beginning, he was terrible. So bad in the pilot episode that NBC wanted to replace him. But by that time, Robert Culp, his co-star, had, you know, they had become friends, and Culp saw, you know, real genius there. And Culp made it his mission. Culp was not only the star of the show, but also was a writer. And he decided secretly to write a half dozen episodes, specifically with the idea of giving Cosby's character, you know, more to do, and to show that Cosby, you know, could become a dramatic actor, and eventually that he could get the girl, that he could also play, you know, romantic scenes and plots and so forth. But because Cosby really needed help, Sheldon Leonard decided that he needed an acting coach. And he hired Frank Silvera. Now, Frank Silvera was, at the time, one of the leading African-American stage actors in the country. The original Shakespeare in the Park in 1962 was Frank Silvera playing Lear. So Sheldon Leonard flies Frank Silvera out to the West Coast to be on the set to be Cosby's acting coach. And I mentioned that in the book. I mean, you look in the index, he's there. But Cosby, even though, you know, I spent a lot of time talking about how he was helped by Robert Culp and Sheldon Leonard, but in his mind, Frank Silvera was the third person to who he owes, you know, so much of his success. And he ended up winning 3 consecutive Emmy Awards for acting in that show. And so he was calling me basically to say, you know, and I said, well, you know, if there are future editions of the book, I'll see if I can say a little more about Frank Silvera. But that, you know, again, going back to the earlier question, that's Bill Cosby. He's just, he does not, you know, it's always very specific with him. And again, you know, going back to the effectiveness of the Cosby Show, I think that was part of it, which was the reason that show never, to my view, seemed preachy, even though, you know, he was trying to use it to educate people and uplift people and so forth. But he always did it in this very specific way, you know, with the plots and with sometimes even the props and the, you know, and so forth, rather than trying to lecture to you.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah, well, thanks for coming. Appreciate it.